KINS. We are very glad that you're able to join us today. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with this program, our speakers will focus on STEM topics and their correlation with Torah. We have redefined STEM a little bit to add medicine and psychology to the usual topics of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Rabbi Dr. Yehuda Krohn, who just happens to be one of my favorite davening partners. His topic is the anatomy of bad midos, the intersection of psychology and Torah. Rabbi Krohn received his smicha from Yeshiva Derech Eson of Far Rockaway and his doctorate from the Illinois School of Professional Psychology. He meets with and counsels individuals, families, and couples in his Lincolnwood practice. He also writes, edits, and presents on Torah and psychology, the psychology and the intersection with Torah. Rabbi Krohn has been sharing his Divrei Torah with the Kins Shabbos afternoon shiur for almost 2 decades. He is a board member of Nefesh International, holding the office of secretary. Our plan is to permit a question and answer session after Rabbi Krohn has completed his presentation, so please don't unmute yourself until that time. It is now my pleasure to turn the program over to Rabbi Yehuda Krohn.
Thank you. I'm going to try and set up our share screen.
Okay.
So that we can have it. And let's go. And there we are. Okay. I'd like to dedicate this class to the women of the Shabbos afternoon shiur that I've been part of for a good 20 years. This shiur has helped me study Torah more in depth and more critically than probably any other mechayev, any other responsibility / obligation. I would add to that my students and / audience in that shiur are always teaching me. I've learned so much from all the members, from all the people, from all the women who've attended that class. So this particular class is dedicated to you. I'd like to share a special appreciation to my good friend, Dr. Stephen Karish. He is truly a gentleman and a scholar, and I was going to mention as well that he is my favorite davening buddy. I'd like to also mention that it seems to me that it's almost exactly a year ago from the night that Kins dedicated all of the mezuzos in the shul, beautiful, beautiful mezuzos and beautiful, beautiful cases in the memory of Dr. Karish's son, Zichrono Libracha. May we merit a time that we can once again not only look at the mezuzos, but kiss them and show them the honor they deserve. Lastly, I'd like to share an appreciation for the larger Kins congregation. It is particularly because Rabbi Matanki, Rabbi Bressler, and the lay leadership of Kins understand the relationship between Torah and science, and that Torah values science, that it often relies on scientific findings, that I've been davening at Kins, and I've become more of a member over the past 6 months. And now to the presentation. As Jews, we've been learning about Midos from the youngest of ages. If there were younger people here, maybe some of their introduction to Midos would be Jewish media. I don't know how well you can see the picture on the screen, but I know a lot of children and even parents who relate to Midos because they played the marvelous Midos machine. And that teaches us a lot of things about Midos. I mean, it teaches us in particular, sometimes it's even a kind of grim observation of mine. It teaches us that children are supposed to have Midos, not necessarily parents. But of course, we're really all supposed to have Midos. We learn a little bit about Midos through children's media. As we get older, we have moros in school who teach us what good midos are, what bad midos are. They very specific to us, show good midos in class, especially when we go on a trip, on a field trip. We're taught to make a kiddush Hashem and not a chilul Hashem. Show good midos, the world is looking at you. And as we get even older, we start to read Sefarim. We read in Pirkei Avos in particular about the danger of negative midos, of bad midos, like hina, tava, and kavod, which are envy and unbridled pursuit of pleasure. And kavod would be, you know, I'd call it a narcissistic pursuit of honor. We learn about the danger of anger and laziness. We learn about Bilam, his bad traits, his unbridled pursuit of pleasure, and his again narcissism. We learn about Korach and his bad traits as we go back in the Chumash. We learn about midos from a very early age, and the relationship between midos and psychology has always intrigued me. Are they one and the same when we start talking not just about midos, but psychological understandings of individuals? On the one hand, they both seem to be an attempt to understand patterns. In the case of bad midos, why do people repeatedly commit harmful behaviors? Or simply self-sabotage? Why do they do maladaptive things? That's often the question that psychologists are asking. So on the one hand, there's a lot of overlap. On the other hand, there seems to be a difference, at least that I've picked up. When it comes to midos, we're often judging someone. We're often saying, you've got bad midos. Some people have good midos, but you know, those who are struggling have bad midos. And that seems like a strong judgment of them. Psychology, on the other hand, seems more interested not just in judging people, but in measuring, understanding people, measuring what's going on, describing what's going on, and finding a way to remedy whatever is the problem, the pattern, the bad midah, if you will. Now, when I was studying the intersection of midos and psychology, I actually reached out to a bunch of my colleagues. It was about 12 of them or so. I sent them an email saying, do you see a difference between midos and psychology? And you know, should we be telling people don't use the word bad midos? And the messages that they gave to me were that you should not use midos if you want to slam other people. You know, sometimes we refer to midos or bad midos when we're talking about others. They've got bad midos. It's like when you're in shul and the Rav of the shul has given a drasha, a sermon in which he's giving musar, he's chastising people, and you walk out of there and you say, I'm glad the Rav told those people what they need to hear. We sometimes use midos in a similar way to find what's wrong in the midos of others. So don't use bad midos if you want to slam other people, or you shouldn't be using midos to slam other people. Similarly, we shouldn't use the term bad midos to allow ourselves to become hopeless. How many people have said, well, it's not, you know, I guess I just have bad midos. You know, if someone calls you out on a particular behavior, you've been hurtful, you've been controlling, you've been doing dangerous things, and they say to you, why are you doing what you're doing? You wouldn't want to just get off the hook and say, well, I guess I have bad midos. We shouldn't become hopeless about being able to change ourselves. I know of a particular yeshiva where they understand or they believe that they're studying musar in depth, which involves a certain degree of self-insight. And they'll sometimes say among each other, well, you know, why do I do such a strange thing? It must be that I have low self-esteem. Okay, let's continue now. And you know, just as when it comes to midos, just as when it comes to diagnosing ourselves having low self-esteem, that shouldn't be the end of the conversation. It should be the beginning of a conversation. So too, we shouldn't let the pronouncement, maybe I have bad middos, be the end of the conversation and I really don't know what to do about bad middos. One more thing that I'd like to add to a way that we should not use bad middos is we shouldn't use bad middos to heap insult upon injury. And here's what that means. If I find myself repeatedly doing something wrong, and there could be so many reasons, and we'll talk about them in just a little while, about why I would be doing something wrong. If I repeatedly find myself doing something wrong, it's bad enough that I'm doing something wrong. It's bad enough that I'm damaging myself at work or in shul or in my family. Do I also need to heap insult upon injury and say, and in addition to all that, I'm a horrible person. I must have bad middos. Don't heap insult upon injury and just say bad middos is just one more diagnosis that I have with no real hope of changing that. So let's talk about why it's good, instead of just saying we have bad middos, to start looking at them more in depth, to look at them from a psychological standpoint, to look at the anatomy of bad middos. So first of all, the value of looking at the anatomy of middos is it allows us to describe the middos in perhaps greater detail. We're allowed to look, we don't just say I've got bad middos, we're able to say, look, I'm looking at specific anger issues that I have, specific issues about frustration tolerance, specific issues about self-control. We're able to look at those, but not only are we looking at the specific issues, we're also allowing ourselves to dig deeper. What's underneath my anger? What's underneath my frustration issues? What's underneath my self-control? What's, just as when you do anatomy, you dig deeper, you look under the skin, you peel under the viscera even, so too, when we're doing the anatomy of middos and looking at them from a psychological standpoint, we're allowing ourselves to dig somewhat deeper. So that's one. Number two is that when we look at the anatomy of middos, it gives us a roadmap for healing. Because if I can identify the specific causes to what we've called bad middos, there are treatments available for each of those bad middos. If it's a cognitive issue, if it's a biological issue, genetic issue, an issue where I have chemicals in my brain that are causing certain things, if there are issues of trauma, if there are issues of incorrect thinking, if there are issues of family, there are ways to heal that the more specific we go as we talk about middos. So again, not only is it good to know what the specifics are, it also, knowing the anatomy of middos, knowing the psychology of middos also allows us to find a way toward healing. Third of all, it allows us to have greater compassion for ourselves. Middos often presupposes, when you say someone has bad middos, it almost always assumes that we've made bad choices in our life and we're continuing to make bad choices, and we probably will always make bad choices. If you look at the anatomy of middos, if you look at the anatomy and at the psychology behind them, you might begin to understand, well, wait a minute. I didn't ask to be born with these genes. I didn't ask to be born with the family of origin issues that I have. I didn't ask to be placed in a complex marriage. I didn't ask to experience trauma. And that at least gives us an opportunity to say, I'm not all bad. I have work ahead of me to fix my middos, but at the same time, it's not all laid at my doorstep. It's not that I willingly chose all of these situations. A lot of them came to me without my choosing them. So until now, we've talked about the advantages in a general sense. I'd like to start talking about specific problems that we typically attribute to middos, and look at them at ways that would include the anatomy of middos, that would include the psychology of middos. When we look at people who suffer from addictions, whether they're gambling addictions, whether they're addictions that are related to substance abuse or even porn addictions, we tend to view ourselves in really negative ways. We will say that a person who has them has poor self-control. We'll say that they're consumed by taiva, it's unbridled pursuit of pleasure, and they're just as bad as Bilam Harasha, for example, because he was a Baal taiva. He was a nefesh v'chava. He was someone who only, who pursued even the most base of his desires. And it's very easy for someone who is mired in an addiction to look at it just as that. And what I like to say is, let's peel parts of addiction back. We're going to look at 3 specific types of addiction, and we're going to look at different causes, different possibilities. When we talk, for example, about a gambling addiction, we can look at it simply as someone who has bad taiva or poor self-control. We could also look at it in terms of what Skinner, a behavioral psychologist, called was operant conditioning. Skinner was a famous person who set up experiments with rats and pellets and all that. And when he discovered was that if you reward a particular behavior, you increase the likelihood that that behavior happens. Inversely, if you stop rewarding that behavior, the behavior goes away. So you might think with gambling that since people usually lose, they'd stop gambling. But what's interesting about gambling is that there's a third principle, which is that when there's a variable rate of rewards, that reinforces the behavior the most. Meaning, if I sometimes win and I sometimes lose, which is often the case when I'm playing with the slot machine, I'm going to continue doing that behavior again and again. That behavior gets reinforced in me. So if someone is trying to get over a gambling addiction, instead of telling them you've got bad midos, it's useful to say, let's look at your behaviors. Let's look at ways we can condition you, and let's look at ways we can actually find a way to get you out of that addictive behavior. There are behavioral techniques in that regard. Let's talk about substance abuses for a moment, smoking or alcohol addiction. When I mentioned smoking, I specifically did not say what we're smoking, which, nowadays there are lots of there were always lots of possibilities. Oftentimes people, I remember once actually this is many years ago when my kids were in the J League, playing baseball, and a person would often come and stink up the place because he smoked these really smelly cigars, and I didn't understand why he was doing it. And years later, through various ways, I came to understand that this person wasn't just someone who was thoughtless and didn't care less about others. He wasn't just selfish, but rather he suffered from deep anxiety and was someone who was always worried about the future. He was worried about the present. He was worried that bad things were happening. Sometimes he had specific fears about what would happen. Other times he just had a vague sense of uneasiness and he couldn't even pin it down on anything. And the way he managed it was by smoking. The way he managed it was by smoking. I'm not here to do a smoking commercial, but if you have someone in your life who's smoking and you can't figure out why they won't stop, oftentimes they're trying to manage anxiety. It's not just anxiety that people try to manage with substances. Sometimes they're trying to manage mood. If someone is frequently down, or not only are they sometimes down, but sometimes they're down and sometimes they're elevated, meaning, they're almost, headed toward too much happiness or mania, they can often feel a sense of lack of control over their lives and over their moods. Just don't know. They'll say, what mood is going to wash over me? Is it going to be a happy day or a sad day? And one of the ways to kind of seize control, it's a false solution, of course, but one of the ways they'll try to seize control is by drinking or by smoking again. And it may or may not give them at least temporary control over their mood, but of course it can eventually lead to addiction. If we don't look when someone who is drinking or smoking, if we don't look at the possibility of underlying mood disorders, we're doing them a disservice. I'm going to talk about something a little bit more touchy, a little bit more delicate. We're going to talk about porn or sex addictions. First, we're going to talk about it in the context of someone who's married. And we'll often say the person who's married and is into all that sexual stuff clearly they're a terrible person. They're a terrible, we're going to talk about it as a husband for simplicity's sake. Terrible husband. Why are they looking at all that stuff? It's unfaithful. It's damaging to the relationship. Don't they know that? What we don't understand is that sometimes what's happening when there is a porn or sex addiction is that there are genuine intimacy issues happening between husband and wife. Some of those issues could be what's called a pursuer-distancer dynamic, where, let's say in this case, the wife always wants to be with the husband, and the husband is frightened by her wanting to be with him so often, and frightened by her wanting to know so much about his life, and he hides more of his life, and he runs away from her more. And the more he runs away, the more she pursues him, and the more she pursues him, the more he runs away. That can be one dynamic. Sometimes there's a different dynamic where, let's say, the husband wishes to be intimate more and the wife wishes to be intimate less, and he feels that she's controlling that. He might try to devalue her currency, so to speak, by finding an outlet, a different way to have his sexual needs met. So sometimes porn or sex addiction has an underlying intimacy issues. Other times, there's something even more complex going on. And here I'm referring to the idea of a trauma history. I'm going to give you a little bit of a primer on trauma. This is going to be the deepest discussion we're going to have about a mental illness issue. Here's what happens with trauma. Trauma is when a person is subjected to a horrible experience, an experience that feels either life-threatening or threatens their bodily integrity. And that can include sexual abuse. When a person has been traumatized, particularly, whether it's a near-death experience or sexual abuse, what happens is that their brain stores the memory in a different place than it would typically store your typical autobiographical memory. So if I have a regular memory, let's say not a traumatic memory, let's say I want to talk about what happened last Shabbos. Imagine that there's a little person inside of my brain that walks up to a bookshelf, pulls out the book that says Last Shabbos, and reads from that book. It knows that it's reading from a book. It knows that it's remembering. It knows that it's not a live event, and it remembers that event. With trauma, I don't have access to the bookshelf. And also, it's not a verbal memory. It's a memory that's often just fragments, bits and pieces, flashbulb memories, as it were, shattered. That's why I have the picture of the shattered glass. It's just fragments of memory that a person has. When a person doesn't have access to such memories, the traumatic memories, you can't just walk up to a bookshelf, so to speak, and remember them. However, when something similar to the memory occurs, let's say you have a soldier and he remembers and there were horrible explosions during the war, and he hears a firecracker, all of a sudden, the memory comes back. The memory comes back in such a powerful way that we call that, it's as if the person is reliving the memory in the present. And we call that, of course, a flashback. Now listen to this point. Here's where it comes into porn addiction. Just as a person can have a memory that comes back and the person is experiencing it in the present, some people don't have it come back as a memory. They have it come back where they inexplicably do the behavior that had traumatized them. So if they were abused, they might put themselves in an abused situation again, or they might even become the abuser and do abusive things or do terrible things or do sexual things that they would never do on a conscious level. And so some people who have porn or sex addictions, and I work with them, in fact, are not just doing bad things because they feel like doing bad things. They have trauma that is reenacted behaviorally through the fact that they're going into pornography or going into sex addiction. Again, it's not just about bad Middot. It could be either intimacy issues or trauma history that could be powering and energizing an addiction. We need to understand that if we're going to try and help a person get out of those things. What if you're dealing with an angry or controlling person? Usually we'd like to say, okay, they're angry, controlling person. It's a Baal Kas. It's a person with anger. Kol hakois kilu oved avodah zarah. Whoever gets angry, it's as if they're worshiping avodah zarah. Bad people, right? No, not necessarily. Sometimes someone who is angry or controlling is anxious. Like we spoke about it before, a person who's anxious often feels that their life is out of control. And sometimes when we feel that our life is out of control, it doesn't make much sense, but we try to at least control the stuff that we can control, which is the people around us, and they become our pawns. Doesn't make it right, but at least we have a roadmap to understanding if we deal with anxiety, maybe we'll help work out some of the issues about controlling. 2, some people have issues with family of origin, FOO, family of origin, in healthy conflict. They might have never seen their parents resolve a conflict. And so from their perspective, conflict where we have conflicting needs is a toxic situation which requires one of 2 things. One person has to always give in, and the other person has to obliterate any opposing views. I work with people on both ends of the spectrum. Some people actually always give in, and they seem to be happily married, except they're highly resentful. And other people don't always give in, but they try to obliterate opposing views because they've never seen people learn how to manage healthy conflict in a way where they can actually solve a problem together instead of one person giving in. There's also a distortion in place where some of us treat our lives, all of our life, as if we're a chef who's making a masterpiece to give to others. So a chef is totally in control of what happens. He can choose the recipe, he can obtain the ingredients, and can flawlessly execute that recipe. And sometimes the distortion that we have in our minds is that I can also create an observant family. I can create an observant family. I can create a well-functioning business with lots of employees. I can make a frictionless marriage. It's all up to me. Of course, the reality, as Barbara Coloroso says, is that we only control 50% of the relationship, of a dyadic relationship. That's myself. I control myself. We influence 100%, but we control only 50%. People who are angry and controlling people live with the illusion, the cognitive distortion, that they are responsible for the outcome and that they must control the entire relationship. When you're working with an angry, controlling person, therefore, you're looking at their anxiety, you're looking at family of origin issues, you're looking at possible cognitive distortions. We're gonna do one more type of person. This is my favorite one because I have a lot of clients will sometimes tell me, well, I'm just lazy, when they haven't done something that they know they should do, but they haven't done it anyway. And what's really going on when someone is lazy? So the first part of laziness is, I want to talk about depression in a little bit more depth than we've talked about it until now. Until now, we've only talked about depression as a feeling of sadness, but depression has other correlates. It has ways of thinking, and it also has even bodily energy. Someone who is depressed has less energy. There's a horrible term called psychomotor retardation where they move slowly. It's as if they're walking through water while everyone else is walking through air, and it's hard for them to move. Sometimes when someone doesn't do what they need to do, if they're depressed, there's simply less energy available to them. In addition to that, and I'm not sure how easy it is to see this, there's what's called the cognitive triad, or ways of thinking introduced by cognitive therapists. Beck in particular spoke about how we can have negative views about the world, negative views about ourselves, negative views about the future that can contribute to a sense of, why should I even start a project? The world isn't going to let me do it. I don't have that much ability anyway. And when I look toward the future is bleak anyway. Why should I ever start a project if I know that it's not going to succeed? So again, we have lack of energy, we have beliefs that can get in the way. Some of us have a complicated childhood, and part of that complicated childhood is we might have had parents who scolded us, who told us we were no good. It doesn't even have to be that. It can be parents who've abandoned us, whether physically abandoned us or emotionally, parents who convey the message that my world is not important. Part of our work in such cases is not just to say, well, it's all my parents' fault. It's to kind of separate us from the message that our parents have given us and who we ourselves are, but it's a process and it takes work. And it's not just about laziness, it's a sense that we've taken on over the years. I cannot get things done. Last enemy, or the last contributor toward laziness, is actually perfectionism. There are some people, and this goes back to anxiety, there's some people who are so anxious that everything has to turn out just right, perfectly. And they're so afraid of not having a product turn out right that they won't even start it half the time, because why should I start if I'm not going to have the right thing? I worked for the longest time with a client who would not go to Minyan. And the reason he wouldn't go to Minyan or even wake up to daven was because he discovered that sometimes when he davened, he would have wonderful kavanah, intention, and other times he wouldn't. And the times that he had good intention, kavanah, were so wonderful that he never wanted to subject himself to a davening where he wouldn't have the right kavanah. So he didn't daven at all. There can be multiple causes to what we experience as laziness. And if you start looking at them in greater detail, then you can remedy them. So that's the bulk of the presentation. I just want to summarize again why we're doing an anatomy of Midos. We want a detailed description of what's going on. We need to know, is it genetics? Is it a mood disorder? Is it family of origin? Is it behaviors that need to be extinguished? Is it trauma? Is it parenting issues? We need to orient ourselves, roadmap toward healing. We need to orient ourselves toward our healing goals. For people who suffer from certain forms of depression and anxiety, meds are appropriate. For people who need to study, for people who need to work on behaviors, there are relaxation techniques. For people who have unrealistic expectations, there are ways of breaking cognitive distortions. We can reevaluate how we relate to our family of origin in deciding how to relate to ourselves as people. And there are specific ways of healing trauma that are a little bit beyond the scope of our conversation today. Finally, it's important when we look at the anatomy of Midos that we have compassion for ourselves. It's not just if I keep doing the wrong thing that I'm a bad person, but rather there are multiple factors at work. Some of them are my choices, and some of them are things that I was born with, or that came to me at a very young age, or that came to me not of my choice. And they're all part of my mix. And I need to have compassion on myself. We need to have compassion on ourselves. If we can have compassion on ourselves, it radiates outwards, and we can have compassion for others as well when they seem to have bad Midos, and help them get the help that they need so that they can get better, instead of us just branding them. Particularly as we stand in the month of Elul, where so much of our work is on making ourselves better, on reevaluating our lives, and reevaluating our behaviors, our attitudes, our approaches, our relationships. It's important to approach our lives with compassion for ourselves, compassion for others, compassion for the seemingly bad Midos we have, with an understanding that we can make life better. So that is the presentation. And at this point, if there are questions, Dr. Karish, I trust that you would let me be able to do that. I'm going to end my share so that we can go to the screen. Is that okay?
Sure, and I'm going to just make a very brief announcement before you answer any questions. I wanted to thank you personally for your excellent presentation today, and thanks to all of those who are participating in the Zoom meeting. I hope you enjoyed it. And now you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask Rabbi Krohn any question that you might have. Okay. If there are no questions, then one brief announcement before we will sign off. The next STEM Zoom meeting will be 1 week from today, September 15th, and the topic will be a Jewish perspective on risk assessment. The speaker will be Rabbi Ruvain Brand, Rosh Kollel of the YU Kol Torah Mitzion. And for next week only, please note that the start time will be 1 o'clock since Rabbi Brand was unavailable earlier. And after next week, we will resume our regularly scheduled times of 12 o'clock noon. Also, at any point in time, if you want to determine what the next speaker and topic will be, just visit the KINS website at congkins.org, and it will be posted there in plenty of time for you to make that determination. Again, Rabbi Krohn, thank you so very much. Any last minute questions from anyone? Okay. If not, then we will be signing off. And thank you so much.
Goodbye to all.
The time slot is done. When they say they're recording, can you pull it up again?
I don't know.
I doubt it.
I have to find out.
That was just, if I hadn't read that Lakute, I wouldn't know all this. He announced who was talking next week at 1 o'clock.
That's the picture of us. This thing here. That's our picture.
Whoa, you're
Look.
gonna tell me I'm on a camera?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, no. Really?
Yes.
That's terrible. Look what I look
Yeah.
like.
I mean, that larger.
Oh my God, I don't want it. Oh, let me see what else is on there. Are they getting that?
Yeah.
Huh? That's terrible.
That's when he said if you have any questions, you just.
Oh, because I unhooked it.
Yeah.
Close it up. That red thing.